And good morning or good afternoon, wherever you might be across the fruited plain. This is Pete Peterson, the very grateful dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy. Delighted to welcome you here to the fourth in our Quest for Community webinar series, American Identity Post the 2020 Elections. This again is the fourth in our Quest for Community webinar series, one that began back this summer, and we'll continue with one more we're looking to schedule before the end of the year. And I'm delighted to not only welcome you all, but welcome my friend and co-director for the American Project here at Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, Rich Taffel, who will moderate today's conversation and introduce our terrific panelists. Rich?
Thank you, Pete. I'm very much looking forward to this and I'm glad you're all here. I just wanted to give a little bit of context for what we're doing today and talk briefly about the American Project and how this fits into the program. In the spring of 2017, the American Project gathered many of the country's leading conservative activists and thought leaders at the Malibu campus of Pepperdine. And we wanted to assess where the conservative movement stood today and to try to imagine its healthy future. Now, following this gathering, participants did essays and media, and we had insights. But one of the big things that we took away from that gathering was that America was deep in a crisis of isolation and loneliness, and that was being reflected in our politics. And as we looked deeper, we saw even that our own conservative movement, with its emphasis on individualism, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, has played a role. And we needed to tap in deeply into the depths of conservative thinking to pull out the communitarian solutions. You can learn more about this at the American Project website, which we'll put into the chat. So we've been continuing in our effort to find solutions. We've been holding this webinar series, and we've explored strategies where conservative principles can best address America's brokenness. In this webinar, we want to make this topic as tangible and concrete as possible by focusing on the possible role that getting involved locally can mean toward identity, particularly after this election. We'll be looking to our speakers to share both their policy insights, because they all have that, but we'll also be looking for their personal insights in the work that they're doing. They each come from very unique backgrounds. Now, to help us think this out, this panel will delve deeper into the topic, and it will be kicked off by our keynote, Tim Carney, who will set the stage by speaking to what he's learned from his 2019 breakthrough book, Alienated America: Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. In his book, Tim explains that geography, more than we typically assume, is destiny. Strong communities function not only as safety nets, these are where we find our purpose. That's a very bold proposition. We're looking forward to learning more about that. Carney's study of the 2016 election was profound. And since then, the COVID crisis has exacerbated our alienation and loneliness. And this is made even worse by divisions along racial lines, and now with our election along the lines of political ideology. We're curious to get Tim's take on what's going on and what is the role of local community in terms of a solution toward identity. So following Tim, we will go to our next panelist who will respond, and that's John Wood Jr., a national ambassador for Braver Angels, America's largest grassroots bipartisan organization devoted to political depolarization and creating community across political and racial divides. John's a former nominee for Congress. He's the former vice chair of the Republican Party of Los Angeles. He's a musical artist, and he's a noted writer and speaker on the subjects of racial and political reconciliation. and he's also the co-host of the Braver Angels podcast. Once we hear from John, we'll shift over to Angela Saylor. Angela is the vice president at the newly launched Follner Institute at the Heritage Foundation. In this role, she's become a bridge builder between traditional conservative communities and local communities long suspicious of the conservative movement. Previous to this role, she's worked as in the Office of Community Liaison at the White House. She served as a White House surrogate, holding briefings at the White House, and she also served as Deputy Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Education. In 2000, she was George W. Bush's campaign director for African American Affairs. We're hoping to hear both from her policy position, but also from her personal role as a translator in our culture that often talks through each other. And then following Angela, we'll hear from Rachel Barkley, who the American Project met in her role as the Director of Outreach for the U.S. House of Representatives Conference Chair. And she was also the Director of Coalitions and State Outreach. She has a long background in building coalitions at the local community. Rachel recently started her own business, R.K. Barkley Consulting, to help organizations advance policies toward personal freedom, promoting human dignity, and building coalitions. She's also a fellow of the American Project. Rachel has also been on a profound personal journey. Just 3 weeks after having her first baby and turning 30, she was diagnosed with a rare spinal cord tumor that threatened her life. The tumor and the surgery to remove it had left her a quadriplegic. She and her husband Taylor survived months in the hospital, a near-death experience, rehabilitation, and now return home to regain family life and movement in Rachel's body. Rachel's career in local community building with her husband turned out to be one of the smartest life investments that she's had to experience in this new life. She will share some of those details, but we look forward to getting her very personal take on the power of local community and the importance of investing in it. Each of our speakers will speak for 10 minutes, and after they've all spoken, we'll have a brief period of question among the panelists, and then we will open it up to the chat. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please put it into the chat and we will move through those questions toward the end of our program. We will end promptly at 2 o'clock here on the East Coast, Eastern Time, and so I will be wrapping up just before that. We will respect the 2 o'clock closing time. So at this time, I want to get beyond introductions and I want to let Tim Carney kick us off with his reflections on the importance of local community to build back our country. Tim?
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. And I want to talk about two terms that have gotten a bad rap, and not undeservedly so, but you hear them in a negative light, and I want to cast them in a more nuanced light. Identity politics, and tribalism. Both of those have generally, there's been criticism of them, but in recent years, they've definitely become kind of curse words from both the right and the left, from Trump's critics and critics of things like the Black Lives Matter movement or the 1619 Project or something like that. I know there are threats from identity politics and tribalism, but I think we need to have a better understanding of them if we're to talk about how to stop tearing us apart and start bringing us together. So I want to start in that lovely togetherness that is Twitter. Over the summer, I was watching, because I have to, as a political reporter, I was watching the Democratic convention. And the day that Joe Biden spoke, I sort of had rushed my kids to bed and barked at them down the stairs. Hey, you guys say your prayers on your own. I gotta do this. Get out of my hair. Then there were like 5 stories of how Biden would leave DC on the train, get home to Delaware to tuck his kids in. And I couldn't even go to the next bedroom to tuck their kids in. And so I was thinking about this and looking at these stories. And as I went to bed, I put up what I thought was a nice tweet. I said, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden, but this tonight made me want to be a better dad. I woke up to about 8,500 hate tweets. The most typical one, well, I'm not going to quote them because most of them are not appropriate, for any sort of company. But basically, you're a bad dad if you're not going to vote for Joe Biden. It wasn't even if you're going to vote for Donald Trump. It wasn't anything like that. If you don't vote for Joe Biden, you cannot be a good father, was the message of the majority of these 8,500 hate tweets. Now, one important thing to remember is that's not a normal reaction. I know tons of people in my daily life, in my church life, in my family who are voting for every imaginable candidate. And if they have criticisms of me as a dad, it has nothing to do with how I'm voting or not voting. But that was normal on Twitter. There's a growing sort of mindset. There's a certain kind of person who elevates politics above everything else. And I think that this gets at the heart of a lot of the problem. My colleagues here at AEI conducted the survey of community and society. They asked about loneliness, which is something that this American project was formed around. They found that active members in their community, in volunteer organizations and churches, were less lonely for sure, except for those whose activity and volunteering was about electoral politics. There was, in fact, a positive correlation between putting up a yard sign, saying that you put up a yard sign, and feeling lonely, between rallying support to vote, particularly to vote for your candidate, and feeling lonely. And there was a negative correlation between getting involved in church or in some local non-political group and feeling lonely. And I think that the causality in this goes both ways. That correlation is there. I think that politics both fills a gap from a loss of local community and it displaces involvement in local community. And so if we're going to talk about fixing this, we need to, A, convince people that politics, national politics, isn't the be all and end all, but maybe B, build that natural part of themselves that wants to belong to something with something else, and then they won't go in search of politics. Now, obviously, there's a lot worse things that sometimes fill the gap than politics, right? I first sort of started down the path that led to my book, Alienated America, when the shooting in Las Vegas happened, and the brother of the shooter said, I can't explain this. This guy, he didn't have any beliefs. He didn't go to church. He didn't belong to anything. There's no explanation for this. And I realized that lack of belonging and believing might have been the explanation. And when you looked in Charlottesville at the guy who murdered Heather Heyer, who drove into the crowd, and you followed his life, he didn't have a father in his life. He didn't have a religion. He didn't even really have a hometown. His mom had moved around. And he settled on white nationalism. And if you look at the sort of the history of everything, whether you're talking about ISIS or street gangs like MS-13 or white nationalism, it's men who don't belong to something, who don't feel a need, get drawn towards a place where suddenly they have a role to play. And so we can't just curse tribalism and identity. Humans are a tribal species. We need to belong to tribes. And if people aren't provided naturally with sort of organic local tribes that they belong to, they'll seek out something else. The best case scenario is just a Joe Biden Harris sign in your yard, and that's all that you care about. The worst case scenario is a lot worse. And again, back to 2016 election and 2020, when I looked at the supporters of Bernie Sanders, I didn't find they were mostly motivated by Medicare for All. They said, I finally belong to something. I have agency. I'm organizing a Bernie rally. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And Donald Trump, if you ever went to his rallies, especially in 2016, they weren't angry. They were almost like a religious revival. And one of the things I realized, and that the data bore out, was that the people who supported Trump the most in the early primaries, not who chose him over Hillary, but in the early primaries, the people most likely to support him were white evangelicals who did not go to church. As your church attendance went up from never to more than once a week, your likelihood to vote for a different Republican like Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio also went up. So a lot of people who turned to Trump in the early primaries, who believed the American dream was dead, were the people who didn't have a religious community to belong to. And similar with Bernie Sanders. A study published at the Cato Institute found that among Republicans, among Trump voters, your warmth towards races or other minority groups was predicted by your church attendance. Now, so a Trump supporter who went to church every week was more likely to feel warm towards immigrants, was more likely to feel warm towards blacks, Hispanics, gays, etc. That's not to say that the gospel makes you better people. I think it does. I think it absolutely does. I'm a Catholic. I believe that the sacraments give us graces. I also think that belonging to a community, ideally a diverse community where you get to know other people, but a community that's local and human, where you are called on to serve other people, when you have a role to play, makes us less likely to be scared of and angry towards the others. So we need to foster more healthy communities. Most of us probably belong to these, whether it be a church community or a PTA or a Little League or our office. A lot of America doesn't, and that's where a lot of the division and the ugly identity politics comes from. So I'll just wrap up with this. How do we think of a positive identity politics or positive tribalism? Think of sort of that expensive aisle in the grocery store. In my neighborhood, you walk in and it's off to the right. And at first, if you're an inexperienced shopper like me, you're like, oh, that's where we get the apples, because it says local and it says organic. Now, I don't actually shop in that aisle in the grocery store, but I do try to shop there when it comes to what do I belong to. Local, not just in some philosophical way, but on a human level. If you're volunteering, if your work is dedicated to people you see, that you work with, that you're in the same room with, that is key. And organic, the tribes that come up over time, that come up serving something else, where the rules aren't just legislated from on high, but are sort of negotiated, hashed out over years, where the purpose is really developed through ideally generations, those are going to be healthier tribes. Now, that said, in America, tribalism, religion, all that stuff has often been correlated with exclusion, to some extent necessarily so, and in some ways gratuitously. So that's one of the things that I hope we're going to talk about here. That you can't have an us without implying a them, but everybody needs an us. So I hope we can hash out a little bit how we get to a good identity politics and a positive tribalism, because we are people who will find identity in the roles that we play and need to belong to a tribe. And hopefully that doesn't mean a war of tribe against tribe.
Wow, thank you very much, Tim. You not only laid out the problem, you offered a solution, and then you raised another question that we can all think about today of addressing that. Beautiful. I now want to turn it over to John Wood Jr., who you'll remember is the National Ambassador for the Braver Angels. And I want John to offer his reactions to Tim and also share what he's been doing to build community through his organization. John?
Well, thank you very much, Rich. And thank you to everybody who is here and taking the time. I think some of you may be on your lunch break. Thank you to everybody who's taking the time to spend a few precious minutes with us for this conversation. And listening to Tim really reminds me of just what is special about the American project and the sorts of conversations that we're having here, because I frequently find myself in the interesting position of, on the one hand, having a deep sort of sympathy for this kind of heterodox spectrum of Americans who are concerned about identity politics, who are, of course, concerned about tribalism, because, well, I'm one of those people, and I can only admire the sentiments of folks who are of the sort of feeling that what we really need to do is embrace the objectivity of reason. We need to transcend the labels. We need to transcend the categories and come together as one American people. Ultimately, there's so much to be said for the idea that there needs to be a sort of superordinate kind of identity in American society that we strive towards. And yet, even in order to get there, I do think that we need to remember so much of what we have forgotten on the left and right in America today, which is to say that our salient source of investment in American democracy and in the American community comes with the thick, close, and personal ties that we have with one another on the level of family, on the level of community, and even within the context of some of our subcultural communities, where we find the backdrop of our cultural existence initially forged within the larger umbrella of a diverse American society. And so when we think about what it means to build a positive identity politics, to build a positive tribalism, it has to include ultimately honoring all of these discrete sorts of categories of difference that exist between, between the American people, in a way that highlights deeper harmonies of values and virtues and interests that are spread across the spectrum of diversity. And from that, I think, lift up a more common and universal conception of just what America is, in a narrative and in a fashion that can bind us more closely together as we move forward into the 21st century, and in so doing also begin to stabilize our institutional life in this country. And so Tim is just spot on. And to pick up sort of where he left off, I'll talk a little bit about Braver Angels and what it is we were experiencing. So a number of you in this group will likely know a little bit about Braver Angels. We were founded as Better Angels. Our initial activities kicked off in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election, founded by David Blankenhorn and formerly of the Institute of American Values, and Professor Bill Doherty of the University of Minnesota. We held a gathering. This was before I was involved in the organization, but we held a gathering of about, I think, 10 or 11 Trump and Clinton voters, 10 or 11 on each side, in a barn in South Lebanon, Ohio, in December of 2016, just to see if folks in this community that was politically split down the middle, highly polarized, would be able to rediscover some common sort of feeling of humanity and neighborliness between them through moderated exercises. That went so well that word spread of what these folks were doing. The founders of Better Angels jumped on a bus, crisscrossed the East Coast and the South, holding workshops that sort of bottled this formula. And the organization is spread now, a few years later, into a national, really what's sort of, you can better think of as kind of a national civic community. We have about going on 12,000 dues paid members in the organization, but our programs touch many, many more people. We have about 60 local Braver Angels alliances across the country. We have a fledgling media network. You guys are looking at our screens here for the Braver Angels podcast. I'm in our recording studio in LA. We have presences on college campuses. We have been able to touch tens of thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of Americans at this point through our programs, through our media content, et cetera, et cetera. But our initial program offering was something called a Red-Blue Workshop, where we take small groups of conservatives and liberals, or reds and blues, again, as we say in-house, bring them together not to argue or debate politics, but to speak from the perspective of personal or lived experience, if you like, in order to sort of shine a window in terms of why we see politics the way that we do. And in various different ways, we give folks on either side of the political divide the opportunity to see to have a window into the internal dialogue taking place on the other side of the political spectrum. And in so doing, it's quite literally the application of marriage counseling to the relationships that exist between Republicans and Democrats. People came to Better Angels, now Braver Angels, and still come to us for two different reasons, I think. And it's interesting because these reasons are almost polar opposites of each other in some sense. The first reason people came to us was to heal, right? People suffered a breaking of relationships in their families, as well as in their workplaces and with friends, people who are close to them, in their neighborhoods and their communities. People were experiencing the breaking of their relationships, and they were coming to us to find a way to either heal relationships directly in some cases with the people who they had fallen out with, or to gain some perspective on how it is that, on the other hand, they may be able to restore their own sense of seeing the other side as human, seeing their father or their daughter whose politics had completely become offensive to them. They came to us to see if by participating with us, they could reshift their sort of frame of understanding and come to a place of being able to empathize and humanize folks who they had once cared about, maybe and still cared about, but who had grown distant from, to see if they could recapture that spirit of connection. Second reason people came to us was because they wanted to engage with politics more directly. They wanted to actually jump into the fight in some sense, but had lost their sense of confidence in the idea that they could do so in a constructive way, in a way that built collaboration and consensus, going through the traditional channels of the Republican and Democratic parties. And what we have discovered, a big part of what we've discovered over the course of our work is that while empathy is a vital sort of mechanism for allowing us to sort of understand on the basis of our relative experiences how it is that people come from a different perspective and arrive therefore at a different set of politics, but may in so doing still be operating from a moral foundation that somebody of a different point of view may nevertheless be able to relate to, and therefore we can restore connection on that axis, right? We came to realize that ultimately, beyond the simple mechanics of empathy, our ability to rebuild relationships that are sustainable, not just between individuals, but between groups of Americans, ultimately has to sort of resolve down to our ability to take those points of empathy and repackage them into a larger sort of understanding of the fact that within the points at which we are able to empathize with each other as human beings and Americans lies a larger sort of catalog of experiences and values and virtues that should undergird the sense that we are one people as an American people, even as we are Black, even as we are white, even as we are liberal, conservative, progressive, libertarian, that there is some common project that binds us as a national community. But even in pursuing that goal, that coming to sort of localize the context of that interaction, that sort of empathetic discourse in a way that binds us to each other on the level of identity, takes on its own character and flavor when we are having these conversations in Tennessee as opposed to New York, when we are having these conversations in rural and working class communities as opposed to campus communities and cosmopolitan areas. Every place we would hold these workshops, and now we're doing these things digitally and the audiences are geographically more diverse, but we still have localized and geographically specific engagements, particularly ones that are facilitated by our local Braver Angels, our community-based Braver Angels alliances. We come to discover that the conversations that people are having that allow them to build these bonds of connection are necessarily tied to where they are locally, geographically, and also, I should add, find themselves needing to engage with the dynamics of race and the ways in which ethnic and subcultural communities shape our frames in terms of how we relate to each other across racial lines and how it is we relate to each other within a racial context. And so the challenge for us has been to establish context for forging connection that lead to shared identities that are specific to geographic and subcultural contexts, but that also allow us to embrace a wider umbrella that is inclusive of all these different contexts into this larger theme of what it means to be an American. And so perfecting these processes, and it is an ongoing project, believe me, but improving these processes and scaling them up in a way to where we can show the American people that these relationships are possible, that there is a way to build them on the civil society level, and that from this we can draw a narrative and a story of what it means to be an American that is more deeply informed beyond platitudes by the deep sorts of experiences and relationship crafting that we are conducting and demonstrating in our work, to pull a narrative from that work that can highlight for the American people this idea that we do not need to, that we can reach a higher oneness as a community, a higher sense of shared identity without sacrificing the things that are important to us on the subcultural and the local community level. That has been the project that we have increasingly committed ourselves to in the context of this highly divided time that we live in. And so happy to answer a question or two about that as we go. Honored to be in the company of such great minds and thinkers. And so, Rich, thank you very much, man. Back to you.
Thank you, John. That was really fascinating how you talked about the paradox of embracing diversity, but also a broader project and introducing the whole concept of healing. I thought that was really excellent. But at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Angela Saylor from the Heritage Foundation, get her take on Tim's opening comments and any thoughts about the world that she's been working that's been so unique. Angela?
Thank you, Rich, and thank you to Pete and all the work that you all are doing, and to the incredible panel that I've been afforded to be a part of today. As I was listening to Tim, I was kind of thinking and reflecting, and one of the places that I start with the work that I do is by asking myself that question. And, do we want to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States where men were free? And as we know that we're battling for the heart and soul of America, and there feels like there's a pull between those who are fighting to preserve freedom and those who may be seeking tyranny, I'm reminded of Irene Cobb, who was 2 generations removed from slavery. Irene Cobb, with her God-given talent and less than a 6th grade education, understood the value of freedom, and she taught her grandchildren, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, the American dream is possible through faith in God, a strong family foundation, and an unwavering work ethic. So I credit the lessons of my grandma Irene for my determination to get up each day working to build bridges. And what I think is really exciting about the work that I'm doing here at the Fulner Institute and the Heritage Foundation kind of speaks to the fact that over the so many years of working to build bridges, this position has created an opportunity for me to be able to put the political component of engagement aside and to really be able to focus more in on policy. And so what we do is we are safeguarding the sanctity of the American idea, and we're exhibiting its validity and relevance to all Americans, especially those who have lost confidence that our nation is a place of hope and opportunity and community for all. Dr. Fulner, who our institute is named after and in his honor, often says that, our movement can only grow by addition and multiplication, not subtraction and division, which would lead to our demise. And so we are advancing conservative research and scholarship towards promoting that American idea of exceptionalism and cultivating meaningful engagement with civil society. We're bringing those things together. And we're reaffirming and illuminating compelling messages about the founding principles, regardless of one's race, creed, or class, and how they are impactful. As we know, America was the first nation in history founded on a specific creed, a fundamental belief in liberty and equality for every human soul. And it is a creed rooted in natural law and natural rights, and its political expressions can be found in limited government and popular sovereignty, in the separation of powers, and in a vibrant civil society that's animated by private associations and faith communities of every kind. And we believe these ideas are central to America's identity, and over time have entered into America's distinct political, social, and economic culture as a nation. So, whenever you set a course to do something different, you have to be bold enough to face the challenge and resilient enough to complete the journey. And we are arming communities, again, as I said, no matter race, creed, or class, with policies that foster an excitement and enthusiasm about this nation. So a part of what I just want to kind of go over quickly is that those policies are founded in the family and civil society. We believe that, civil society organizations stand between the individual and the state. And it's here where private citizens can work together in ways that help preserve freedom and foster individual responsibility and virtue. And we are, through our policies, at every turn promoting, choice in education. And we think that education is a concern or the American people, because it is a part of how we can pursue truth. And we believe that the pairing of that with civic education has been a rallying and collaborative conversation that's been pulling people together. And of course, we look at our dynamic and free economy as a blueprint for not only wealth and jobs and capital that have delivered and a very desirable standard of living for many Americans. And it's also provided the United States with an economic basis for its national security and status as a great power. So you're probably saying to yourself, okay, that sounds real policy centric, but this is what makes the Fulner Institute magical. We are taking that and then we are coming together and bringing that together with people in local communities. This institute is a part of our effort to get out of Washington and to try to get away from some of the Washington talk, if you will. So what we did first is we said we need to make sure we look at the research, the data, and analysis to look at some of the challenges that we would have in front of us as we pursue this work. And so some of the questions we had to ask is, how do you message to your current family and also to the new friends you want to make? In other words, in launching a new institute to bring new people into the family, what words do we use to resonate with both groups? What images do we protect that are familiar and comforting to both our base and at the same time inviting to those who want to engage? And finally, how do we provide a platform where both our base and those we are courting to become friends with have the freedom to listen, to learn, and to lead sustainable relationships, working together towards common goals? So the research, the data, and analysis created an incredible foundation for us to launch our engagement. With our base, we discovered a few important things. We wanted to know what were those issues that were going to strike an emotional chord and not just a rational perspective about things. And they boil down to a few. Our base was just totally concerned about the decline of moral values and the slipping away of the words, in God we trust. Concerned about patriotism and its decline. A biased educational system that they feel are failing our youth today. Additionally, with the importance of preserving our freedoms and really looking at the foundation upon which America was built toward that end, and then looking at the difference in and the importance of free enterprise as being crucial for American progress, juxtaposed to the negative impact of socialism. So real quickly, we looked at age 16 to 34-year-olds, and here we were able to understand that if we wanted to reach that age group in an impactful way, we could see that they had ideas that line up with conservative principles, but they didn't really feel comfortable with the brand. And the opening, the opportunity was talking about policy-specific messages. Hispanics, this group was the largest conservative base and had the most capacity for reaching other conservatives that we had not touched. And 65% of them believe that racism is a serious problem in the nation. And again, this community says that being an American citizen is the only place they'd like to have that title and when they look at nations around the world. Asian Americans, very different. They have a negative view of both conservatism and liberalism. And that tells us that in general, there's disinterest and skepticism about politics. And finally, African Americans, this group showed a distinct gap between political principles and the application, but their support was overarching on issues. But that support dropped off when you started looking at specific policies. So good information to tell us as we were ramping up to see how we were going to forge forward and really be able to connect in local communities. We believe that the only bulwark that can stop the destruction of America for generations is an informed and energized people. And as I said, we are really working on the front lines, trying to renew the American dream by bringing the founder's vision of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to new audiences. And so we know that if you stop growing, you'll start to die. William Burroughs tells us that, and we believe the American people are our last best hope for restoring America's civic culture. So we've been bridging the divide. We've been doing that. An example of some of our work there is through our National Restoring Civics Coalition with over 60 leaders and organizations there. We're building bridges with parents and teachers and school board members to dismantle the anti-American claims about the history and achievements of our democracy and to restore the proper teaching of civics and history. We are forging new alliances with institutions like historically Black colleges and universities. And an example of this is with historically Black colleges and universities, we've been able to really get in there and lock arms towards bolstering those institutions as an American asset toward global competitiveness and military preparedness. And we've done that through the launch of an HBCU working group and a national HBCU forum. And then we are fostering new voices by training community influencers and convening private off-the-record listening sessions with center-left and center-right leaders. And as we do that, we're building an army of new voices to promote the American identity through their stories of how policy has intersected in their lives to help them move forward and to be able to put forward those models that are working across the country. Robert Frost reminds us about the road not taken, and I quote, "Two roads diverge in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. By one traveler, long I stood, down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." I look forward to being able to continue to have this conversation.
Thank you, Angela. That was great. I was particularly curious to learn more about the data that you're finding here about local communities, what their specific values are, and articulating what the values of your base are and seeing how that matches up. You're really quite a translator. I'm curious to hear more about that. But thank you so much for that. That was excellent. Now I'd like to turn to Rachel Barkley at RK Barkley Consulting, and I'd like to get her reactions both to Tim's opening comments, and also I'd like to hear some of the work that she's done as far as investing in local community and bridging the gap. So Rachel, you turn it over to you now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rich. And my co-panelists and the American Project are doing such essential work diagnosing the problem of the growing divide in our nation. And I agree with them that pointing to local community reinvigoration is the answer. But how do we do this? We are in the midst of a great global economic change due to automation and technology. There's secularization of the West, and not to mention the current pandemic. There is not going to be just one national solution to all of these great problems. The solutions, I believe, are going to be hyper-local and probably cultural rather than political. I wanted to share my personal story of community as maybe a starting point to think about this. Perhaps it contains some encouragement that things are healthier than we think they are, but also some admonition for the conservative movement and those who want to solve these problems there. So my story, my husband and I experienced the highest high and the very lowest low last summer. I gave birth to our first healthy baby boy in May of 2019. We had 3 great weeks at home with him before I got a shocking diagnosis that I had a rare spinal cord tumor that was slowly paralyzing me. My only option was to operate and to fully remove the tumor from my spinal cord, a tricky surgery that would likely have some collateral damage, I was told. Although I went to the very best surgeon in the country at Johns Hopkins, I still woke up from the surgery as a quadriplegic, mostly paralyzed from my shoulders on down. The next few months, my family and I fought for my life and my mobility in a rehabilitation hospital. I slowly came to learn how to live as a wife and a mom in a wheelchair. I mean, I could write a book about the daily realities of this, but I will just state the obvious that everything is a little bit harder in a world not made for wheels. Thanks be to God, I can now move all of my limbs, and I'm still recovering movement, strength, and feeling every month. But I don't know if I'll be fully healed or not. Starting a family looked drastically different for us than we thought it would. I was a marathon running, mountain climbing Capitol Hill staffer at age 29. At age 30, I was a disabled cancer survivor, and I was a wheelchair mom. I share all of this not to make you shed a tear for me, but because in all of the heartache and all of the tragedy, my husband and I have also been given so many gifts. As the song by John Foreman says, the shadow proves the sunshine. So how does all of this tie in with Tim's thesis? There are things that I learned in my personal crisis that I believe are applicable to our national crisis. So before all of this happened, I lived and I valued the ethos of personal responsibility and individual liberty. I spent 10 years in a career building coalitions with conservatives around policies rooted in these values. And let me make clear that I still very much believe in these values, but I think I define them a little bit differently now. We as humans, we all come into the world dependent, as my baby boy has made abundantly clear. If we are blessed to live into old age, we usually leave the world dependent. Maybe, just maybe, we get a few decades in between where we are totally independent. I've learned that independence can be a blessing, but interdependence is a reality. This is why it is important, I believe, that we include people with lived experience of disability in the conservative conversation on policy solutions. It shouldn't be too hard. According to the CDC, 1 in 4 American adults have some sort of disability. People with disabilities bring a valuable perspective because we live with the reality of human limits, be it mobility related or even just chronic pain. This has implications for policies around labor, transportation, education, healthcare access, and, well, pretty much anything. By the way, many women also live with these natural limits when it comes to carrying a child, childbirth, and nursing. We as conservatives and libertarians, we tend to glorify an ideal of the perfectly mobile, the physically robust, pull up your bootstraps ideal when we think about the beneficiaries of our public policy. When in reality, every single one of us are going to be limited at some point in our lives in some way. Let me also say that the human condition of interdependence is not a curse. In fact, it forces you out of isolation and into relationship. So how does this relate to policy? How do we design programs and policies that bear in mind the reality and the blessings of interdependence, paired with the values of personal responsibility and individual liberty? I do not have all the answers here. I'm at the beginning of my own journey on this. But I think that if we acknowledged this in all of our discussions, we would start to address some of these problems like substance abuse, inequality, loneliness, and the rapid decline of family formation. So for example, conservative solutions to poverty, which I worked in for a long time, rightly point to a path that takes people from welfare to dignity of work. But often these solutions don't acknowledge how difficult reliable transportation to this kind of work can be for many people. You need to talk to someone who's actually dealt with Metro Access, DC's accessible public buses, to understand the challenges. Bringing people with disabilities to the conservative policy table is a first step towards this. Next, I'd like to dig in more on the joy of interdependence, because I think it's the key to how we solve the community crisis. Shortly after I was diagnosed and we went to Hopkins for the surgery, our network leapt into action. Our parents were the first to show up and help my husband with our newborn and be at our bedside, often advocating in a confusing medical system. Our closest friends, some of whom flew across the country, showed up to bring meals, take care of our house, and just to be a shoulder to cry on in the hospital. Those friends set up a GoFundMe page, helped create our new Caring Bridge blog to update friends and family. We quickly got notice that prayers were pouring in from California to India and even Ukraine, and donations anywhere from $10 to $10,000 came in to cover every meal for our families, all the hotels, all of the medical bills, and eventually the medical equipment and renovations needed to accommodate my transition back home in my newly disabled body. Upon our return, a friend used the website Take Them a Meal to set up meal delivery, so that was one less thing we needed to worry about. We had dinner 3 days a week for almost 4 months. Our supporters were family friends from our hometowns, church friends, people we didn't even know from church, strangers who read about us on the internet. Overwhelmingly, it was the people who we worked with in the conservative movement over the years. The outpour was incredible, and the generosity overwhelms me to this day. Our family was able to speed down the road to recovery without fear of financial ruin and all of the benefits that accessible equipment could provide me. But I acknowledge that it is not like this for everyone. In the months I spent in the rehab hospital, I heard stories of young guys who were in wheelchairs from gunshot wounds, who faced an uphill battle because they didn't have loved ones available to drive them to all the appointments, or the money to install a ramp outside their house to even allow them to enter and leave freely. Yes, health insurance doesn't cover things like ramps. I saw people undergoing grueling physical therapy all alone, while I always had a posse of friends and family saving me from depressing hospital food. So I can't tell you the many and complicated reasons that those others were not surrounded by support, but I can tell you why we had community, or in public policy speak, social capital, ready to invest when disaster struck. First and foremost, my husband and I have been committed to community all of our adult lives. We made decisions on where we live based on how easy it appears to create community. We constantly invite people into our lives. In fact, when we first met, we actually started to decide hosting quarterly dinner parties we called Deep Thoughts dinners, and we fell in love over the many years of hosting those dinners together. But let me say that these are not all Instagram charcuterie board moments and Southern living soirees. This also meant over the years welcoming in friends in crisis, or people who in this season may be more difficult than life-giving. It brings tiredness, complications, depletion of resources. What I'm trying to say is that creating a bank account full of social capital takes commitment and it takes sacrifice. It doesn't just happen. For my last point, I want to continue the metaphor and talk about when a crisis occurs, how does one go about from withdrawing from the social capital bank account? This is where our modern time has actually revolutionized this. Technology and social media allowed the word to spread like wildfire about what happened to us. Our story and our needs were on Caring Bridge, Facebook, Instagram, the Take Them a Meal website, Twitter. This also led to traditional news coverage on local TV stations. So we must remember that for every negative story about how social media is pulling apart, there are also probably 5 stories about how it brings us together. So in closing, I can, tell many stories of takeaways from what I've learned, but in closing, I'd like to summarize my 3 points. That 1, the conservative movement must shift to recognize interdependence as not only a reality, but an asset. 2nd, community building takes effort and is a labor-intensive project. 3rd, when crisis hits, your community is essential to recovery. And technology allows us to accelerate how that community support is built. Thank you for listening to some of my story, and thank you to Rich and Pete and the American Project for tackling these important problems.
Well, thank you, Rachel. That was really beautiful, and I really appreciate how personal it was. You shared some really personal stories, and what you did is you took a very, which can be an abstract topic, and you made it very real about the importance of interdependence and the importance of investing. We tell people to invest in their 401k. We tell them to invest in the bank to save money. And you talked about investing in social capital and the relationships. I was struck by the fact that in Tim's book, he starts off in a hospital story, and your story reminds me that when we just ask ourselves, what would we do if we needed to go to the hospital? Who would visit us? Who would take us? Many people can't answer that question, so it kind of puts a point on what you're saying. So I will only challenge one thing you said, Rachel. You are an expert. You're a national expert on this topic. That was a beautiful presentation that really brings home so many of the points of the conservatism of connection. So thank you so much for sharing so deeply. At this time, I'd like to return to our keynote, Tim, who's now heard these various examples of people building community across barriers, across paradox at the community level, at the national level. And Tim, I wanted to see if you had any reactions or any other questions that you'd like to raise with the panelist.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Angela, John, Rachel, for those. I mean, really stirring my mind, getting me going. Rachel reminding me our story of our daughter in the hospital was pretty easy ultimately, but you're reminding me of how when people brought meals, they always brought dessert. And normal people, adults in their 30s, don't eat dessert 3 nights a week. So when with our kids, we'd always get these meals. So I would always put on the baby weight after the baby was born. Thank you for reminding me of that. But a few things. One, John, I think, started a conversation conservatives need to have more of. It's wrestling with what diversity is. And we know, if you're my age, you remember in the 90s, this diversity being forced on us from the left that somehow rubbed us the wrong way. And these days we're getting certain lessons that's basically saying, oh, well, you have to just shut up if you're privileged. And it's not actually about diversity. On the other hand, in my own parish, I love the fact that my kids know more countries of Africa from where their classmates are from than I knew until I was in my 30s. Frankly, Eritrea came about like after I graduated high school, so I only learned about it from my daughter being like, oh yeah, my classmates from Eritrea, and that diversity is beautiful. And part of it is, I'm sure you found, John, and I hope you can comment on this, finding our similarities often involves saying, I had that way because this is how my own culture, my own religion, my own upbringing, my own neighborhood brings it up. So I'll throw that to you. Just I want a couple points before I throw it back to you guys. Another, Angela, talking about the need to engage the 16 to 34-year-olds. That's where I found alienation was one of the big things. I mentioned Bernie Sanders. I also camped out with Occupy Wall Street back in the day, if you guys remember that. And I was surprised they weren't talking about sort of Wall Street regulation or bailouts or the Iraq war. The talk was all saying, well, these banks have too much influence. We need more campaign finance reform. And I didn't agree with their policy proposals, but ultimately, I didn't sleep very well on the concrete in Zuccotti Park. Lying there, I suddenly realized, wait a second. They're not upset about policy. They're upset about the fact that they don't feel they have a voice. And I, of course, argue that the average person isn't going to have a great voice with the federal, with the SEC or with Congress, but that they need their voice on a local level. But that loss of a ability to flex your political muscle, it's easy for a libertarian or conservative to say, don't be a busybody, mind your own business. But that's wrong. We are supposed to not just live our own lives, but shape the world around us. And that can be how we reach out to young people and say, we can help empower you politically. Because that's what Bernie and Occupy are saying. And we can say that too, and mean it on, we're going to connect you to an organization in your town that's going to allow you to make a difference. They're going to need you. They're going to say, hey, buddy, we need you on Saturday. Otherwise, we can't do what we need to do. That ability to shape the world around you is what's needed. And finally, on interdependence, I think of, again, two conservative mistakes. We hear Barack Obama say, you didn't build that. And we respond with, yes, I did. Well, guess what? I kind of built a dining room table and 2 benches for my kids. We have a small dining room and 6 kids. So my wife's like, it has to be certain dimensions. You just have to read Adam Smith to remember, I definitely did not make the nails or the screws. I certainly didn't get the wood to all be at right angles, okay? I certainly didn't make the glue, the table saw. I mean, it would get boring for me to go on. Capitalism, production, creativity always involves interdependence. And that needs to be stressed. There's no more conservative, there's no more better praise for the market than the praise for interdependence and our need for one another. And it takes a village to raise a child was the other thing. Who knows what Hillary meant by that, right? But Rachel, every mom needs other people helping raise their kids, especially as they get older. I always say the Catholic schools we send our kids is because our kids finally needed a positive adult male role model at some point in their life. But honestly, like I can say you have to show your work on your math. It doesn't sink in. I can say, you really have to, lift your back elbow when you're swinging a bat. It doesn't sink in. I can say, don't talk to your sister that way. I've spent so much family capital. And this came home to us during the lockdowns when we were trying to be our kids' teachers and parents. We didn't have any capital left. We didn't have any energy left. We need the village to raise our kids. And so this is just my reminder to conservatives. If the left says something that sounds weirdly collectivist to you, don't go to the opposite, which is a hyper-individualism that we were warning against. See, how can we actually apply that on a human level? And finally, what Rachel has experienced and had, if we want to help people, and we should, what my old boss Arthur Brooks here said is we should wake up every morning saying, who needs help the most in this country and how can we help them? We know that a lot of people think, oh, well, if you're not doing well in life, then that's your own fault. And we know that a lot of people think, no, you just need a check from the government and a government program. But we know that the answer is in the middle. We know that more people need to have what I had when my daughter was in the hospital and what Rachel experienced. And what I wrote in my book is that when I was describing who was bringing us the meals or smuggling the dark chocolate or beer into the hospital or taking our kids to school, it was never, oh, just a friend. It was a friend from our pool, a couple from our parish, a family from our kids' school, somebody from AEI or the exam. There was always these institutions that cause the connection. And so that is how we help people. I don't know how to do it, but the people who need help, the single moms, et cetera, they need to belong to something to give them that purpose and to give them the safety net. So I've kind of thrown another question at the rest of you three. So Rich, I'll let you mock.
Excellent. Yeah, you did. You threw them right back a really great question on each, very specific to what they talked about. So I'm just going to go in the order that we went for the panel, and I'm just going to start with John and your reaction to Tim's question and anything else that you'd like to raise in a few minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Tim, you had mentioned this kind of mechanism for connection whereby the sort of necessary ingredient to our being able to sort of see something in another person and establish a bond has to be sort of being able to draw a parallel between what somebody else is going through and what we have been through, even if it's not exactly the same thing. And that's absolutely something that comes through in the work that we do. In fact, one of the most famous friendships that has come out of Brave Rangers, just because it's something that sort of found its way into media stories, is a relationship between a couple of folks I'm happy to call friends, a man named Greg and a man named Kuyar. Greg is an evangelical Christian in Ohio and a former small town sheriff, and Kuyar is an Iranian immigrant who's I think head of the local Democratic Party or Central Committee. And in a workshop that they were both a part of, Greg got up, I think during one of the intermission segments, and very strong feelings about Islam. And he goes up to Kuyar and he says, listen, he said, pal, he said, I've got to tell you, he said, I've got a problem, he said, with Islam. He said, and I can tell you this in 4 letters, I-S-I, and before he could complete saying it, Kuyar interrupted him. He said, stop. He said, I know what you're going to say. He said, but I have to say this to you. My religion has been hijacked. And I think he may have even asked him, he said, can you relate to the idea that people you don't agree with might have hijacked your religion too? And, Greg, thinking about it, didn't have a tough time coming up with, a million different examples of people who he felt had hijacked Christianity in the name of values that didn't reflect who he was. But one thing I want to sort of drill in on a little bit that you, I think, made me think about is just this fact that more broadly speaking, we've got this culture of diversity that is meant to bring different folks into a space with each other, right? And it's funny because this grows. This is connected to the civil rights movement. This is connected to the project of integration. That's a project that I am personally kind of a product of in a million different ways. I come from a multicultural family and a multicultural community and was blessed to do so. But the way we have approached diversity and integration as time has gone on is to push people into sort of a box of diversity that, to borrow certain language that folks use in inclusion spaces and so forth, doesn't allow you to show up as your secularized, formula for this. I mean, many folks just on a religious level aren't able to enter into these spaces as their whole selves because the way we see the world, the frame through which we see the world as people of faith just isn't portable in different spaces. And so we have to leave big parts of who we are at the door. On an identity basis, I was reading in Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility how it is that there is, quote, no such thing, it's close to a quote, there's no such thing as a positive white identity, right? And for some white people, the idea of being white doesn't carry much meaning with it, but for other white people, it does. One of the really interesting things I've tracked in the anti-racist conversation, if you listen to what folks like Ibram Kendi and folks in the anti-racist movement are talking about, they are insisting on being allowed to be Black, which worries a lot of people because it seems like a racially divisive thing. And there's all sorts of excesses in that movement that I could talk about at some length. But the thing is I also have conversations with people just in the Black community on a local level, right? And there's resentment of a sort of diversity that requires people to enter into a multicultural space where we only are allowed to be cognizant of the things that we have in common, but we're not allowed to really highlight the things that make us who we are in a different kind of way, right? And so I feel like there on the left and on the right, if we could, it is by no means to seek to sabotage the larger integrationist project, to point out the fact that if we're going to pursue diversity and community, it has to be of a type that allows for people and groups to show up in the fullness of who we actually are in our different contexts, right? And that's where so many of the tripwires, I think, are in front of us. The liberal paradigm as we have known it in terms of the integration project is not sufficient to that task. Can a conservatism of connection fill that space? I think that it very likely can. And so, Tim, I may have missed something that you threw at me in there.
No, thank you.
That's what you brought to mind. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Angela to get her response.
Tim, thanks for your question. As we look at the younger generation, and I want to kind of talk about that generation skewing a little younger even than all the way to 36 in terms of what we're seeing. In our orbit, we have diversity of age, across the spectrum, with a multitude of members and people that we engage with who are older. And they are very, very concerned about this dynamic between the relationship that they have between their children and their grandchildren. And as you kind of talk about that isolation piece, we're seeing that even within the structure of the family. And we know that this happens over generations, but for some reason right now, it seems to be more tension there. And as a conservative organization, what we hear is that that next generation isn't really buying into the same ideas and philosophy the same way. And then you've got the parents or the grandparents saying, well, how do I communicate? And how do I not push my child or my grandchild away as I'm trying to pass on these values and these virtues that I know based off of wisdom of what's going to help them to be successful in society. And so on the other side of that, through our academy that we run, we see that age group that's a little wider. COVID pushed us into a place of innovation, of looking at how to do some things different with our internship program over the summer. And so what we found through that, we were able to reach, instead of just 60 young people who come and engage with us, we were able to expand that to like 200. But not only that, we were able to tap now into more young professionals, and not just Americans, but those people who are around the world were engaging. But the point that I want to drive there is the training that we're able to give them through our academy, our internship program, our fellowships. What we're seeing is they feel empowered when they have the information and they're given the guidance on how to look at different resources so that they can begin to develop those ideas for themselves. And where they're confident now in terms of their understanding of history and how it connects to present day issues, they're able to go out and advocate their opinions differently and feel like they're stronger. So, you know, I agree with you. We gotta make sure that those voices are heard. We see in these days of cancel culture and that generation being kind of caught in that with kind of canceling things out, you know, all the way to the founding values of the country. Just cancel it out. That we've got to keep our eye on that. And I'll close on this question with this. For me, this got really personal with my son, who convinced us to let him go to boarding school. And he is a senior this year. And now he came back because of COVID. And so we'd been going along in life with a different relationship of not seeing him every single day and being home during COVID and the tension of the nation. And I had to really stop and pause in terms of what I just described other people were experiencing with their children and their grandchildren, to be able to lean into the conversation with a careful ear, with a heart that creates, you know, an expanded amount of patience, to listen and let him walk through what he's thinking so he can be empowered without shutting him down. And so I just encourage us all to, as we're listening to kids, interacting with them, to empower their voices, but at the same time, give them the power of knowledge so that they're standing firm in their ability to advocate.
Thank you, Angela. One of the things I'm really enjoying about the panel is that we're taking what could be very abstract concepts and bringing it back home to the personal level, which is really how things change and how things happen. It also makes it very real. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Rachel to see if you have any comments on Tim's question and comments about your presentation or any of the other panelists.
Sure. Thanks, Rich. And taking mom notes from Angela here for when my son is older. To respond, I mean, Tim, I think you hit the nail on the head on kind of the pendulum swing reaction to how the left frames interdependence. You know, especially it takes a village. Well, you know, on the individual level, I don't think you would talk to one mom that says, actually, no, I want to do it completely alone. I want to be independent. I think every mom would admit that they want a village to help with their children. But when it came to Hillary Clinton saying that, there was such a knee-jerk reaction from conservatives, right? And I think that it is because it is more difficult for us to articulate our solutions to what the village looks like, because it is complicated, it's hyper-local, it's individualized. And it's easier for the left to create, it's easier to create a program and say, we are going to create Head Start and programs to help you do this. That's often just an easier solution to articulate, and to say, hey, we're actually going to put this on the onus on Congress up there to come up with a solution to these really difficult, sticky problems. And, you know, we would all say that often those programs don't pan out and they don't work, but the need is still there, right? The need for people to have help and to help with their interdependence is still there, especially for vulnerable populations. So we have to put the brain power, I think, in the conservative movement, which is harder work to do, to articulate what that community support looks like and what is the proper role of the intermediary institutions and what is the role of local government, state government, maybe some federal government. And I don't know that we as a movement are there yet on articulating that.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. You raise a really important point. I've always personally been frustrated when compassion in Washington has been judged by whether you are increasing a percentage on a federal program or not. And that's the criterion. You voted not to increase that program, therefore you don't care about kids. And of course, it's more complicated, but because it's more complicated, I think we're all coming to the conclusion that the conservative movement has missed something here by allowing that issue to be defined in those terms, but not really coming back with very concrete responses to those issues. So I think that's a really good point, Rachel. I want to just go back to Tim before I open it to questions from the group, from the chat room. We have a question and I have other questions. But Tim, in summarizing what you've heard and what you've presented so beautifully, any final comments on the overall before we open it up?
Yeah, you just reminded me, Rich, that sometimes some of us, if we're conservative, we're active in our community, we might have more purchase with somebody like Rich, a local pastor, or somebody, or we might run a small business. And the challenge has to be, if we're going to say this is not something Congress should do, this is something local people should do, we have to ask every institution, whatever you think your primary purpose is, are you a hub of civil society that's providing a safety net and a sense of purpose for the people who are there? And religious institutions, sometimes, especially a Catholic church, you don't have enough priests. There's one priest, there's 200 parishioners, hopefully. Are they running operations that are feeding the poor? Or if that's totally displaced by the government, then at least providing some other kind of mercy for people in the community, whether they're middle class or poor. Are they bringing people together, connecting people? That's got to be our challenge to our local institutions, and that applies to a small business too. Your job isn't just to sell roast beef sandwiches and make a profit, it's to bring people together. And finally, on the diversity thing, I think this is really important, and it brings us back to the community hubs. John put it really beautifully when he said, if you're just supposed to be the Black guy or the Catholic or whatever, this quote doesn't allow you to show up as your whole self in the fullness of who we actually are. This is where de Tocqueville saw, he saw everything. But one of the things he saw a couple hundred years ago was that in America, you're getting your identity. You're not just forming it wholesale from whole cloth, like some on the left and some on the right think you're doing. Oh, I am me. I am just me. I am not these parts of me. I think that's wrong. My colleague Yuval Levin here said, no, you can get your identity from the role you play in the institutions you belong to. So our answer to their singular identity is not a different, like super singular identity or just an American or whatever. No, our answer is you're not just one thing. You're 40 things because you belong to so many things. You're a dad, a neighbor, a t-ball coach, a mom, a banjo player, whatever it is. That's got to be our answer to sort of the reduction of your identity to one thing, is not to say, no, we're just this abstract, I'm just Timothy Patrick Carney. No, you find your identity from groups but from many of them. And that's what Tocqueville said was really unique about America, is that we belong to so many, and some of them are divine and some of them are trivial, and some of them are big and some of them are small. And that's got to be our sort of pluralism, diversity answer there, is that these groups do form us and they do define us. We do get our identity, but not just from one thing, from many.
Thanks, Tim. I really appreciate that. We're really dealing with a lot of paradox here, where we're talking about the complexity of humanity. And in a culture that travels in memes and slogans and quick phrases and binaries, we really, I think, as a conservative movement, and particularly the project we're working on, have to embrace complexity, nuance, and the refusal to be put into specific categories, but demand that our complexity be embraced for who we are. That's really what's beautiful about our country. So thank you, Tim. That was such a great panel, and I want to open it up to questions. I'd like to start with the first question from Anthony. And I think this is I'll just say, Anthony, it's a great question he's a student at the school, Stanford, at Pepperdine School of Public Policy. And he says, given the importance of locality, how should we think about geographic sorting based on income? I'm thinking especially of Raj Chetty's work on neighborhoods and social capital at Brookings. And I'll just add to that, one of the criticisms of the American Project in past work that we've done is people say, yeah, you talk about conservative community, it almost sounds like a code word for upper middle class suburban culture. You're not really speaking about, diverse community in different incomes in different parts of the city. So it's just, yeah, you want your community, but you're really not, you don't have a plan for community in general. So I thank Anthony for putting that right on the table for us. And I'd like to, whoever would like to answer, Tim, maybe would you like to start?
I want to jump in because I want to magnify the problem that Anthony is talking about here. We are increasingly live among people who have the same education and approximate income as us. And so we're slightly better we're a little less segregated by race than we were 30 years ago geographically. We were more segregated by class, by income and education. And so that creates a real problem, because a lot of times that income and education is what translates itself into, I can be the PTA president. Not because I was taught how to do it, but just sometimes natural skill, and that those leadership ability or management ability is not as equally distributed. This is what Charles Murray wrote about in Coming Apart, as it was 60 years ago. And then you throw in the fact that distinction on race often correlates into a segregation, on class often correlates to a segregation based on race, and that does persist. And the depressing thing I found in Alienated America was there were not very many cohesive communities that were really diverse along multiple dimensions. So I'm just multiplying the problem and hoping, I know John has dealt with this more, and maybe the others of you have something else to say.
Yes, I have a couple more questions, but I want to see if anybody else on the panel would like to respond to that one.
Just a very brief observation that one of the big challenges to community building, and this has been the case, I think really sort of since the Civil Rights Movement, in the Black community, is the fact that we have sort of come to define, within many African-American communities, traditionally African-American, there's been a definition of success since that time period, which has sort of measured success according to our ability to move out of the Black community. And there's certainly, I think, parallels, and Tim, you write about them, in industrial white communities in Ohio and Pittsburgh and elsewhere. And that, I think, connects to this idea that, success in life is a material thing, your ability to sort of scale the social ladder and ultimately create circumstances in terms of where you live that reflect that success. But what it sacrifices is a definition of success in American life, an understanding of the American dream that is rooted in connection, where people really do find meaning in life, where we really do find fulfillment, and so impacting that understanding, I think, has to be part of our work and deep in the nature of our conservatism.
Thanks, John. We have 4 minutes, but I have a kind of a bombshell question, I guess, but it's been something that's been running through all the conversation, and I want to put it explicitly on the table. Angela, you kind of hinted at it, And that is, we've all talked about believing in the American ideals as a uniting factor. But what about when we don't agree on the American ideal? So I'll refer to the 1619 Project as an example, and the sort of conflicts that have been taking place publicly about that story, which I would personally say it's a very valuable story, 1619, and I think it's an important thing to recognize. So I'm not dismissing it. I'm just saying, if I don't agree with what I've heard you as conservatives describing as the core American principles, how can we have that conversation about a united community? So Angela, I wonder if you might respond to that, because I think you've been in the thick of that a little bit.
Yeah, I have. And what's really interesting about the evolution of the New York Times 1619 Project is they are consistently backing off of that. And if you go to their website now, you see that they are, talking about the founding of the nation at 1776. History is important, and we are not denying that at all. I think that as we are working on this project and we look at revisionist history across the board, what we are advocating for is that the facts are accurate, because that information, as it's taught to the next generation, will impact how those young will lead. And the danger there is in, kind of characterizing an oppressive state that is predicted to take you into perpetuity in terms of the framing of the content of that. So your question, Rich, in terms of, how do you deal with that? Well, interestingly enough, the work that we've been doing, we've had lots of behind the scenes meetings with people. And the thing is that there is agreement that the Declaration of Independence states the founding of the nation. The challenge that we're facing is, how do you create and where is the narrative that addresses the issues to show the folding of Black Americans into the American story? And I am really encouraged by the fact that, we had this tension, but it's bringing forth some positive change, I believe, because we've got people who would have never been coming together, sitting in a room, trying to work through that and looking at how do you put forth the right type of curricula alternatives so that truly our children are taught the appropriate history and that they can really understand the functionality of our government.
Yeah, what I've loved about our discussion today is that we've taken these, what I think are apparently contradictions or things that are at war with each other and opposed to each other. And as Angela just said, there's really good things that can come out of that tension for us. And I think particularly for the conservative movement. We've come at time, but I did want to give Rachel, if you'd like, the last response today as we close out. Any thoughts, Rachel, as we're closing out our webinar this afternoon?
Wow, big responsibility with this crowd here. So I just wanted to kind of add to and applaud the work that Angela and John are doing on this, because I think this ties in actually with being able to talk about interdependence. Is that we as conservatives, in order to be credible voices for the things that we know are true, the values and the history, we have to be able to go there on where perhaps we've messed up in the past. We have to be able to acknowledge that and not pendulum swing just because those are words that the left uses, right? And we can't hide and say, we're not even going to talk about it at all because that's what those people talk about. I think we completely lose credibility and we lose the moral high ground to talk about these issues and show our solutions that, Angela, you're working on real solutions there. And I think we just have to encourage other people that you're not playing. I hear a lot from fellow, people who work in our world that, well, you can't use those words and you can't go there because that's the game they want you to play. And no, we have to fight on those grounds because we do have truth on our side and we do have these virtues on our side. And so we have to be bold in going there like you guys are.
And I thank all of you today for going there to the places that we have often not talked about. I really appreciate the reflection within the conservative movement and not pointing the finger over there and talking about them. We talked about ourselves, some of the shortcomings and things we need to change, and that change will have to come within. So I really appreciate John, Tim, Rachel, and Angela for being such fantastic panelists and bringing these ideas to light. And also thanks to each of you for your work in building back our country, person by person, community by community, state by state, and to a nation. So thank you for all of your work, and thank you all for attending this webinar with the American Project.